Hello, I am Lauren,
And I'm Oliver.
and you're listening to Optimism of the Will, the gayest, most transgender in podcast this side of the left. Yeehaw. Oliver, today's topic, well, it's sometimes what happens when you move left is that you figure out more and more of how the world works, and eventually it ends up alienating you from from the world you grew up in. We are broadly indoctrinated into a neoliberal worldview. This idea that capitalism is correct, that there are no systemic injustices, and
that meritocracy is real.
Yeah. All the baggage that comes with believing in our neoliberal world order. And sometimes that's really freaking alienating from the world around you. I thought where we could start was like when was the earliest moment where you found yourself moving leftward, and then you found that was creating friction with other people or other aspects of your life?
Oh my gosh. So I know I've talked about this on the podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
But the first time I think I noticed it causing like a very significant social problem in my life was whenever at the LGBT organization that I volunteer at, whenever the libertarian lady there was letting the Department of Corrections march at Pride Fest. That was a really, really big deal to me, especially given the circumstances with transphobic bills just very recently being passed. And, a lot of people at the LGBT organization sort of reacted as though I was making a very big deal out of nothing, or like they didn't have the framework to understand why I was so upset. And that was like really, really frustrating because a lot of these people are always, they're queer. They're mostly white, of course. And they kind of put a big show on about how progressive they are, how like virtuous they are, like unironic actual virtue signaling, these kinds of people. And so I think for a lot of progressive liberals, they kind of have this idea that like they don't have any more work to do.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you kind of bring up the like, hey, actually this does not align with my values. I am more far left than you are. What you're doing is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They do take it very badly. Honestly, I've noticed in my experience, there's no way to sit down and like with a liberal to sit down and just say, hey, actually, like, I think you're great in a lot of ways. I love hanging out with other trans people. I think you're funny, etc. I enjoy your company overall, but when push comes to shove, I feel like I can't trust you and that our values don't align because you're not a socialist, you're not a leftist. They don't take it well. I think they feel like you're calling them immoral, like you're criticizing their values, and they lack the framework to understand what they're missing and why you could be passing this judgment onto them. So like having a lot of liberals in my life has been really challenging in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like for example, a lot of my friends, they're like small business owners, and they're broadly liberal. They're like, oh yeah, pay your employees fair wages and give them health benefits, blah blah blah, all that jazz. And it's like, and then I'll have to be like, no, see, the problem is we have a class-based society. You owning the business is kind of the problem. and that is it's a personal affront to them when you bring up this, like like you were saying, this idea that what they're doing could be interpreted as immoral.
They basically go, oh, so you think I'm a bad person?
Yeah,
they take it very personally.
Yeah. A lot of landlords are like this. They think they're just like, some guy surviving under capitalism. No, what you're doing is capitalism. You're what the problem is. Like I had a liberal therapist once, and he tried to I was complaining about landlords, and he was like, isn't that guy just trying to survive under capitalism? And I was like, no, he's not. He's a scalper of houses, like people scalp Taylor Swift tickets, but with a necessity. If there was like a friggin' baby food shortage and you were withholding food from babies so you could sell it at a profit, we would recognize that as immoral. But when it comes to housing, it's like, oh, he's just a businessman. He's taking a risk. No, this is what the problem with society is.
I've paid more than $40,000 on this duplex I've been living at. Like, I should own this place.
You're literally paying for it. Your landlord is taking your money to pay off his mortgage, and he gets to keep the house.
I'm sure it's already paid off by now.
Yeah, it's nonsense. It's flagrantly like it's bonkers. But that's what I'm kind of getting at. Is like you understand more of how the world works, and then it starts creating this friction between you and the world around you. Like a lot of the time, I find it really hard to enjoy liberal media because they're so brain rotted with their liberal ideals, and it comes out in how they make art. Like I remember, did you see season 3 of Legend of Korra?
I didn't get that far into it because I got so frustrated by it.
Yeah, because so the first enemy was like a communist, Amon.
Yes, and he was also, I feel like he was really analyzing a class problem and like potentially like a eugenics problem, right? Or a disability problem where functionally in The Legend of Korra, which is the sequel to Avatar: The Last Airbender, some people have the ability to manipulate the elements, moving with great force huge chunks of rock, like manipulating fire or water. And people who cannot do these things in this world, I think, are functionally disabled. There are a lot of jobs that they cannot do that other, people who can bend can do this type of labor. So I think, I don't know if they talked about it in season 1 because it's been a couple of years since I watched it. But the guy, Amon, wasn't he talking about like non-benders having less economic opportunity as well? Even if he didn't bring it up, it's like that's almost certainly a thing that was happening or would happen in that kind of situation, that kind of society, right? So like this guy, like everything he was saying was correct, where he's like basically a radical civil rights leader for non-benders and like demanding equality for that type of person. And then at the end of the season, they kind of, they did that thing that they do in almost every like fictional, especially like superhero type media, where a left-wing baddie, the antagonist, like eventually he goes crazy. He goes too far.
Yeah.
The lefties always go too far, man. And then they just like unceremoniously blow him up. Like he just blows up in a boat on like the season finale.
Yeah.
And it's kind of just like, all right, now we get to go back to our neoliberal utopia
Yeah.
where, benders and non-benders have unequal opportunities, and that's just how it is.
Where
The
nothing has
day
to
is
change.
saved. Yeah, nothing changes.
And that show was like really weird. Like the left-wing villains got treated way worse than the right-wing villains. Like Zahir, for example.
Shit, I didn't even think about that. I don't know. I'm thinking of at the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender that they just take away the bending of Ozai, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, you can't bend anymore. But the left wing villain, they fucking blow him up.
Yeah,
Are
they
you
blow
serious?
him up.
My God.
Yeah, no, they treat but that's what liberalism is. It's like there's a way Vosh puts it. I'm blanking out on it. He says it's like it's the nice face of fascism, basically.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Like when you got this reminds me of playing Disco Elysium and you're talking with Joyce, who describes herself as an ultra liberal. And interpersonally, she's very nice. But like she arrives in the game as the hammer of this massive corporation. Like she shows up with armed soldiers to put down a workers' strike. But she's lovely
not just
to you.
nice.
She gives you money.
Yeah, she's very charming.
Oh,
also.
she's so charming. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up this quote that I told you about recently, Lauren, by a Holocaust survivor named Thomas Blatt.
Mm-hmm.
He was captive in a concentration camp called Sobibor. And you talking about like the smiling face of liberalism, or really like the smiling face of fascism, right?
Mm-hmm.
He said, "People ask me, what did you learn? And I think I'm only sure of one thing. Nobody knows themselves. Sometimes when somebody is really nice to me, I find myself thinking, how would he be in Sobibor?" And this is ultimately, I think, the crux of the social problem that I experience as a disabled trans socialist in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Like people will kind of like perceive me as like joyless, like, an uptight SJW whenever I don't find something funny. When the reality is like, people like us we're very aware of the active political danger that we are in.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's kind of interesting with this quote that I read, nobody knows themselves. I think that's something that made Joyce from Disco Elysium a very, very interesting character because she's extremely self-aware. Like, when do you meet a self-aware liberal? Basically never. There are very few liberals who understand like a socialist analysis, like a material analysis of the world, and then still decide to be liberals. But from her perspective, like she's somebody who would have been, it sounds like she was rooting for, or actually like would have wanted a socialist revolution on a personal level, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because of her circumstances, she is financially and socially coerced into maintaining the position that she's at, that, she can have the most good for not just herself, but she describes, I think, having granddaughters, maybe also, that their lives would be considerably worse. She's in Martinez and she sees that poverty. And she wants to hold on to what she has. And so I think in a lot of ways, somebody like Joyce, like she must be in a lot of like turmoil and pain to like stuff that part of her away, right? I don't know. She's a really cool character. I like her a lot.
Yes.
But also a very unrealistic character, because I think really typically what you see is if someone gets the education and has access to these ideas, this mode of political analysis, I think that they usually end up like internalizing it and becoming like true leftists, right? And I think that's what's so frustrating about liberals is that sometimes they're like precariously close to getting it, but they don't. Or sometimes they talk the talk. They'll hear something that a leftist says and they like the sound of it because it aligns with their values, at least like on a social level. And so like you will see liberals sharing the first Pride was a riot, like be gay, do crimes. You'll see them share that shit, but they don't actually, either they don't mean it or they don't know what it means. You know, because we were talking about in the previous episode, in St. Louis at the Pride March, the pro-Palestine demonstrators blocking the parade, and we had people in the crowd, ostensibly, presumably liberals, social progressives, who might be the same people who've shared those posts. The first Pride was a riot, be gay, do crime. But when they see the riot happening, the left-wing riot right in front of them, they only feel like distaste from it. They boo when they see that. Man, liberals really drive me completely nuts.
I know. It's a very old story too. Like a ton of liberals voted for the Iraq War. They were in support of it, and they tell you, "Oh no, it's bad." They'll say it's bad now, but back then they were all in favor of it. And it was like, you saw the same thing during like the civil rights movement. Like liberals were very big on like, well, we got to be civil. We have to have civility politics. And then as time goes on, they'll act like they were in support of like this civil disobedience, but that wasn't the case at the time. And again with like Palestine, we see it now. Like the liberals now will be criticizing like the encampments at colleges, that are trying to get universities to divest from Israel. And I promise you, I guarantee you, in the future, they'll be like, no, we supported those.
Yeah, how many years? Like 5-10 years from now?
I don't know. However long it takes for them to gain social cred from virtual signaling. Oliver and I, we both grew up in very conservative areas, and as we kind of established identities for ourselves, we moved from being conservatives into being like liberals, and then from then being liberals into leftists. Can you talk a bit about like that transition of identities from liberal to leftist, and how like eventually you reach a point where it's like, okay, I'm abandoning that old identity for this new one?
I think what's kind of complex about moving from a liberal identity to a more left-wing, especially a more revolutionary rather than reformist identity, is that I really think it's a big theme with liberals that they will talk the talk, but they won't walk the walk. And that's kind of the biggest thing that I notice with liberals. And so it can feel very like misleading to spend time with them and then eventually figure out that they're not who they say they are. They aren't who they think they are. And I think there were a few years where I was identifying as an anarchist. If you asked me what I was, I'd be like, I think anarcho-syndicalism is really based. But at the same time, you'd feel the pressure of the economic and social coercions around you, and it would influence your behavior, where even if you might believe a certain ideology, it's hard to determine, okay, am I acting like this because I'm actually a liberal, or am I acting like this because of the coercion, because I'm trying to keep myself safe? And that can also be difficult to identify in other people, right? But I think what I noticed in myself was sort of like a gradual change where I started making my behavior align more with my words and more with my internal beliefs. And I think having a few years of figuring out that, yes, this is going to be very uncomfortable on like a personal, interpersonal like level. Not talking about like even like the really big economic coercions. If you are a leftist and you have these beliefs, there kind of comes a point where you have to realize, like you said, it's going to cause a lot of friction. And I think the openness to that friction and the acceptance to that friction, and the willingness and ability to tolerate some of that friction, I think that's when I look back and I say, like, this is when I became a leftist, I think that's probably when, right? Because when I was just making posts online or just telling people what I believed, but then letting them trample me, letting them make, horrible decisions on behalf of my community for me, and like not stepping up and causing a fuss. I think I was sort of acting as a liberal when I kept my head down in some ways. And there's kind of like this whole thing of like, you have to prioritize your safety. Like, that's a non-negotiable, of course. But it's a pretty complex space to be, because so many people become your enemy. If you really abide by the things that you believe, it can become very difficult to just get along with the people around you. Mm-hmm. What do you feel like that process looked like for you?
It was a lot of like adopting disconnected but related leftist ideas. And it took me a while to get there. It takes a while, but then, you have little aha moments, and they kind of click together, and you kind of start seeing like the intersectionality of class analysis and of transphobia, and all that good stuff. The pieces start clicking together over time.
It really is like when you're actually putting together a huge puzzle piece, like a huge puzzle, 1,000-piece or whatever. And you get like, you're working on the section of like transphobia, and you're like, okay, I think I got this fleshed out. And then you look over at like your misogyny chunk, and then you're you put them together, and you're like, oh my God.
Yes, exactly like that.
It's very exciting. And then you're like working on your like capitalism and your classism, and you're like putting that, and then like you look at your racism piece over here, and you're like, oh, that's the thing that was missing all along. Jesus Christ, I get it.
Yes.
Like all of this stuff, it all works together.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that's a thing with liberals, right? Mm-hmm. That sometimes they might have some of the pieces, they're missing pieces. Like, for sure, they're not just missing pieces, but I think they're also missing the connections, that these aren't just like little points to memorize. I noticed that with like interpersonal conflict with liberals. Especially like liberals who aren't minorities, they, instead of like figuring out, okay, how can I, learn about transphobia and learn about cisnormativity so that, my trans friend who I like and want to keep around, how can I, like, what do I do about this to make them comfortable and keep them as like keep a good relationship with them, instead of like learning, like doing like this historical political analysis. They kind of like memorize talking points. Like usually socially progressive talking points. Okay, most trans people say this. Most, like this is what's generally accepted. They'll go on r/ask transgender and be like, hey, I think I said something offensive. Is this okay or not okay? Instead of, I don't know, getting the framework. And honestly, like, it's frustrating on the level of not just not being able to depend on them for like safety, but it's also just like, man, why are you not a more curious person? There's so much like deep lore in this world, and like you could understand me and my experiences better. You could be a better friend to me. We could have like a way closer relationship if you investigate this stuff. But like ultimately, I don't even want to say that it's not worth the effort to them, because I'm not sure if that's what's going on. I think for a lot of them, they just don't know that this information is out there, that there's more to it, So they end up having like this very shallow surface level understanding of what to say, what not to say, instead of like joining you in challenging these systems.
Well, it's the lack of curiosity that gets me, like I'd like to believe that, just kind of based on how I analyze information, and how I come to the conclusions that I do, that I would have been like an abolitionist during when slavery was like widely accepted. But like for the average liberal, they don't have that analysis. They would have just been accepting of slavery when it was widely accepted. I find liberals can be very, very good at like analyzing things independently of the wider context. So like maybe they have a really good understanding of like Reaganomics, and they can criticize his anti-union policies, but they don't fit it into like a larger class analysis, like where like, okay, but why did we end up here? And it's just, sometimes I just, like when I used to hang out with liberals more, sometimes I just wanted to like grab them and shake them and be like, no, just extend your thinking a little more, please, beyond where you're at, just a little bit more. And they don't do it. And then there is, like we were talking about earlier, there is that friction where, God, how do I even explain it? It's like you can see in the dark better than they can, or something. No, it's
I
not
almost
even that.
wonder. So, like, I feel like socialists have hella coolness vibes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, oh my God, the socialists, they're so dope. Like, we have like this self-assuredness. And also, I think because we experience like so much alienation, like social alienation, that I think a lot of us come across as like independent, self-sufficient people. Who like don't budge on our values. And I think to some people, like, I mean, think about Call Me Mañana from Disco Elysium. Like, he has hella like, you're just like, that guy is so cool, right?
Yeah, cool.
So I almost wonder, like, maybe more people will become socialists just after seeing how like cool we are, It's like a culture victory in civilization. Because it's just like, damn, I want to be like that. And then so they start learning about socialism so they can be like us.
Okay, so like Okay, so imagine.
Sorry, I'm goofing right now a little bit.
Imagine being like, I don't know, like an abolitionist, or imagine like being really like pro civil rights, and then being in like a context and in a time where like that wouldn't be socially acceptable, and you're running into that kind of friction with others around you, or like imagine you're really in favor of like women having universal suffrage, and other people being like they're judging you for that, and you're kind of socially an outcast, you know. And then this is a thing. This is a similar thing that happens now. Like last episode when we talked about the pro-Palestine protests at the Pride rally, at the Pride parade. Like you're going to alienate some people around you by saying, well, I agree with those guys.
Sometimes, actually often, I think the lesson to take from this episode, what we're trying to say, is that doing the right thing often does not make you more friends. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes you like incredible friends and like incredible allies who believe the same thing as you, who will like actually have your back when they see what you're doing. And sometimes like there is already somebody like you in that situation and they haven't stepped up yet because they don't see anybody else doing it and they don't feel safe, right?
Do you think, so Oliver and I, we both kind of come from like backgrounds where we were socially isolated and kind of like social outcasts. Do you think being a social outcast kind of helped informed your leftist beliefs, where like you got used to this idea of being on like the outside of what is popularly accepted, whether that just be like socially or politically? Do you think being a social outcast like set you up later to being a political outcast?
Honestly, I think you're probably onto something there a little bit. And I feel like you kind of get that vibe from a lot of socialists, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think like for a lot of people to become a socialist, for that to happen to you, for you to go through that process and that education, and that like internalization of like new values that were not previously upheld by like anybody that you knew, you had to maintain some kind of distance, I think. In order for that process to take place, for that metamorphosis to happen, right? And for me, like when we talk about materially what it actually looked like for me to become a leftist, I was, severely disabled by PTSD and depression, unable to leave my house practically, except for like maybe going grocery shopping. Maybe going on a little hike by myself now and then. And when I was at home, or even if I was like walking around with some earbuds in, I was usually listening to like an audiobook about like anarchism, or like, maybe some kind of lefty podcast or video essays by socialists, and like getting this, like internalizing this stuff. And it was a few years of doing that. And it's hard for me to imagine, because like we're talking about this social pressure thing, right? And also economic pressure. Imagine being sort of like a liberal minded, like let's think of today's progressive liberal, like socially progressive liberal, and put them in the context of, 1850s America. And if you talk to the smiling fascist, the liberal, they will say, I do think that slavery is wrong, but I have a lot of friends who own human beings and they're nice guys, like my uncle has an enslaved person. And, even though I don't think it's great, like I think it's bad, but like I still love my uncle. He's been part of my life since I was a baby. So like I can't just like, what do you want me to do? Shoot him? Like I can't do that. Then I would be the bad guy. I would be doing violence. And it's like,
yes, shoot him.
Violence is already happening.
Yes.
The violence is already being inflicted on this person. Do you not understand?
Yes.
I think for a lot of liberals, they're kind of like insecure people who are looking at what is normal. How can I be normal? How can I get along and like try to get through this world with like as a little conflict and like by not being outcasted? Like I don't want to be an outcast. I don't want to be like part of the underground economy. I don't want to be doing illegal things. I just want to get along. I both want to be a good person and I want to get along with everybody. And it's like at some point, I think being truly mature, like in your identity as a person, and especially as a leftist, you have to realize you can't do that. That doesn't exist. You don't get to be a good moral person and get along with everybody, because a lot of people that you love, hopefully not a lot of them, hopefully little of them. But this is the case for a lot of trans people. You know, trans people figuring out that their parents hate queer people and they'll still be like begging for their acceptance for years and years. And they want to get along with them. They try to find a way to keep their head down. And I think having these experiences where like keeping my head down didn't work over and over, and kind of having that lesson beat into me by my experiences, like, I think that was an important part of me becoming a leftist, you know? I remember, you know, I had an abortion when I was 19 due to abuse. And I remember the way that some people in my community reacted to that whenever I decided to be open about it. You know, first there was like this overwhelming force, like this social force where it was like, this is a thing you don't talk about. And it's still like that. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but like abortion is pretty common. It's something like 1 in 3 people who can get pregnant will have an abortion in their lifetime. Very, very common. But I know so few people who are open about having an abortion. And I exist in very, very left-wing spaces. So, you know, the stigma is just like overwhelming, right? And so I've just had these experiences being a queer person as a teenager, being a trans person coming out in my 20s, being disabled, and watching the people around me, some of them liberal, react to that in negative ways. And ultimately, I had to make the decision, like, who am I? What do I care about? And is it more important than what other people want me to be? What other people want me to act like? Is it more important than getting along? Often, yes. Like, is ending slavery more important than getting along with your uncle? Personally, I think it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, that's math you're gonna have to do by yourself. But you know, you have an opportunity to choose, like, do you want to be on the right side of history? Like, they executed John Brown for being an abolitionist. You know, I don't think we're gonna be executed anytime soon, but people are going to be mad at you for being a socialist. And, you know, you have to decide for yourself, like, how important are your values really? How important is it that we are working towards a better world? And if I have to put an optimistic spin on that, because, like, you know, you're gonna experience some form of pushback from being a leftist. And you know what? It isn't always going to be like sunshine and roses. I can tell you that from experience. But I take pride in knowing that I'm making the correct moral choices, that I'm acting in line with my beliefs. And when you do that, like, you're going to attract other people who think that same way, Like I was telling Oliver before we started the podcast, like, Oliver and I have been through so much, but like we've also bonded over a lot of our shared trauma, or our shared experiences of trauma. And we have a stronger friendship for it. Yeah. I don't know, Oliver, what's your optimism of the will for today?
So you were talking earlier about how it's not always going to be sunshine and roses, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the time when we hear about these stories, like of John Brown, for example,
Mm-hmm.
we almost think of like a hero story. And like, whenever you're watching that or reading that, like especially fiction or an actual history, you kind of like, you look at like this information and you like weigh the morality of the behavior. But something that I think we should try to do more often is like sitting down and using your like empathetic imagination to wonder, like, how does that feel? How would it actually feel to come up against this nearly invincible force?
Mm-hmm.
Like, be in a situation where you think, like, I might lose, I might get imprisoned, I might get beaten, I might get killed, but I have to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to do it. Or otherwise, like, if it's not these things, maybe like be socially ostracized,
Mm-hmm.
lose income, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I think putting yourself in these shoes of these historical figures and vividly imagining like what that distress felt like, I think that can be like a really important exercise to like ready yourself to deal with some of these things that you might deal with, because it is really, really scary. I've told you guys on this podcast a story about whenever some coworkers and I went up against the company that we were working for, or rather the funders of the nonprofit that we were working for, because we noticed abuse that was happening in this facility. And it was scary as fuck. And it was the kind of anxiety that makes your chest tight, that makes you sweat, that makes your mouth dry, that makes your guts feel like they're trying to evacuate everything in your stomach immediately. It was really, really scary and really, really stressful. But I knew I could do it, even though I had an anxiety disorder and I've been struggling with this shit my whole life. I knew I could do it because I wasn't alone. And, my coworkers and I talked about that before the meeting. Like, we actually would talk to each other about how we're feeling and we're giving each other emotional support. My coworker was telling me, like, I'm probably going to go straight to the psych hospital after this meeting to make sure I'm okay, because they were like having shortness of breath and almost sort of like cardiovascular distress, and the way it felt in their body was like really concerning for their health. And it was hard. And like the fact is, like, we also did not win in that situation. We did not get the concessions that we were looking for. But when I look at it now, I don't think of it as a failure. I think it was an opportunity for practice. And I did really well with that practice. And I also think of it as a moment of community building that was also very effective. And I also just feel like personally, it was a very great success for me because I did reaffirm my values in that situation. I did the right thing, even though it was scary. And so now I know that I can do that again if I have to. Even if I feel like I'm going to actually shit my pants, I know that I can do it again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is the fundamental difference between a leftist and a liberal. The leftist chooses to be brave. Okay, we've been talking for about 45 minutes, but I think that's pretty good. I think we had a pretty good episode. We are optimism of the will. We are optimism of the will.
Yeah, we are.
You can follow us at OPT of the will on Twitter. And if you like our content, support our Patreon. Give us money.
Please do.
We're so poor. Give us as much money as you can, please.
We're disabled trans socialists, both of us. We're broke as fuck.
We're so broke. Okay.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this because I think this was like a really dope episode, honestly.
Yeah, this is a dope as hell episode. Okay, thank you everyone for listening to us. Please remember just to share this video if you like it.
Also, you can find my Twitter also. I'm not super active, but at trans _ cat dad, I believe that's my Twitter handle. So I don't know, if you DM me, I'm sure I'll get on there at some point. I have the same username on Reddit, so if you're ever what kind of lefty analysis, what's y'all's opinion, you can also just post on the OPT of the will at Twitter. Maybe we can talk about some shit.
Yeah,
this is just a really fun episode. So
absolutely. Okay,
thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you guys. And we will see you next episode. Oliver, do you have your cat? Oh, you know what?
Yeah.
I forgot to ask you for your 10 seconds at the beginning. Can you give us your 10 seconds and then your catchphrase?
Oh, my 10 seconds. I tried 2 jobs this week, 2 small part-time jobs, and one of them really did not work out, and I've been busy and stressed as hell. In case you're wondering about how I've been doing, I also went to a Vampire Weekend concert last night, and it was incredible. And my signing out phrase that I'll leave you guys with today is keep swagging it, along with may all your foes be damned, may all your roads be short and sweet, and all your stories be glad ones.
That's like the Khajiit greeting in Skyrim. May all your roads bring you to Worm Sands.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah, because they're cats and it's like a litter box.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just think of my little guy Sebastian in front of the window every morning, soaking up the sun.
Okay. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.
Bye.